Good evening and welcome to another episode of Unscripted and Unchained RPG Review. I am DM Bluddworth, and as you can see by the graphics, tonight's video is a continuation of my series, Role-Playing Mastery by Gary Gygax. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into Chapter 1. Chapter 1 is entitled The Foundation of Fun. My previous video, which I will link in the we'll link at the end screen portion of this video, really was a preface and just kind of explaining what the book was going to be about. Now we're going to actually dig right into some of Gary Gygax's ideas about role-playing, and some of them are very enlightening. I never really thought of it in that way, so it really is it really is a great pleasure to actually get some insight into the mind of a master, role player, master GM, or dungeon master, and this is really interesting stuff to see basically how he breaks the things down. And I will talk a little bit about each section as I go through it. I'm not going to read it obviously word for word, but I have highlighted various portions of it that I will kind of focus on. So if I do skip over anything, it's not because I trying to ignore it. I'm just trying to focus on certain parts that really resonated with me, and I really do recommend that you try to get your hands on this book, even though it's out of print. You could still manage to find it if you're a collector and an enthusiast, whether it's Dungeons and Dragons enthusiast or just role-playing in general. This really is a book that you should try to get your hands on in your collection. But without further ado, let's get right into it. So as always, I make sure that I get the physical copy of the books. I picked this one up, I believe, for about $50, which, on eBay might have been about that. I know I paid a lot more for the Mastery of Game Mastering. So this was the original, like the first in that series of two books. So this came out in 1987, and it was still produced by TSR. And so you will see some of the, at least I'm assuming, that we'll see if Gary Gygax actually refers to dungeon masters rather than game master, which he did in his other book, because that was after after he was out of TSR, and certainly after the lawsuits that prevented him from using Dungeon Master. But I'm sure that'll come up in here. So once again, I always make sure that I get this. So if I am using a PDF that I pulled off the internet, I don't feel so bad. I do have the original copy. So let's get right into the Role-Playing, the Foundation of Fun. And as you can see, I've highlighted portions of this, and I'm just going to go through. You could follow along and read the parts that I'm kind of skipping over if you wish, but ideally try to get your hands on a copy of this. So to begin at the beginning, it is important to know the difference between role-playing and role assumption. Role-playing can be defined as as acting out a make-believe position. Think of role-playing as taking the position and characteristics of someone you cannot actually become at the time or ever. So, and he uses some examples like a child making believe that they're an adult. That's an example of they can't become that position at the time. But you might also, take it to they're pretending that there's something that they could never possibly be, and that's also role playing. So if you have someone that's you have someone that wants to be a dragon slayer, all right, and that's going to be their profession. They're going to actually go out there and be the slayer of dragons. That's obviously something that you cannot ever be. So that's what role playing is. Now, role assumption, which I wasn't really thinking of, and so again, here comes that insight that you get. Role assumption is generally considered taking a role that an individual could or might actually have. Okay, so, and he uses an example here, assume the role of a modern day private investigator, something he could conceivably become. All right, so role assumption means that you're taking over something that you could conceivably become with some training or, time, effort, and such. Some of the roots of role-playing games, RPGs, are grounded in clinical and academic role assumption and role-playing exercises. And so this is where they kind of overlap, where you can you can be preparing for assuming a role in the future, and then you use role-playing exercises in order to help train you in doing that. So by encouraging subjects to assume a role, or play a role, that is, act out the identity and personality of an entirely different type of person, teachers and doctors have educated and sometimes helped treat misconceptions and maladies in the participants. So these were used in clinical studies as a tool, and oftentimes we hear about role playing as a tool used by sociologists or psychologists or what have you, and so these are ways to have individuals test out certain scenarios without actually having to actually do them, but to assume a role or to role play a scenario out, and then see the various different possibilities for outcomes. Role reversal is also something that is a tool that is used as well. The other roots of role-playing games rests in the early history of the hobby of gaming, especially in military miniature games. Military miniature gameplay is in the direct line of evolution. That fact cannot be disputed. Military miniature games have participants acting as the commanders of forces, large or small, about to become engaged in an already locked battle. The game, for instance, in such the framework of an internation simulation. I think that's supposed to be internation simulation, or possibly even international. It might be a typo. Simulation game. A player might be assigned the role of a minister of war of a particular state. The individual is to assume the persona of a hawk and act aggressively. Other participants might have roles that would require neutral or pacifist acting. All right, and so here you might have in the very foundations of role playing, you had miniatures and wargaming with miniatures where the players were taking on the role of a general. And some players might choose, like, well, this particular general is going to be very aggressive, very hawkish in what he or she is doing. And then this other general might play a more defensive game, all right, and be more reactionary. And so just have maybe not necessarily a passive stance, but a more neutral, non-committal or non-aggressive stance. Playing in an inter-nation simulation, I think that's what it was supposed to be up top. Inter-nation simulation game revolves around stated issues typical of those faced by actual governments. All right, and so a lot of times there are simulations. They're trying to recreate various battles and everything. And again, that goes back to the very foundations of wargaming, particularly miniature wargaming. Military miniature games, usually simply called miniatures by hobbyists, simulate battles or skirmishes, historical or mythical. All right, and so they can also include completely made up scenarios as well. One of these miniature games, actually a booklet of game rules called Chainmail, made its first commercial appearance in 1971. Chainmail included a small section, the Fantasy Supplement, that instructed players on the addition of fantasy elements into the wargame of the Middle Ages. Thus, heroes, spell-casting wizards, fire-breathing dragons, magic swords, giants, trolls, werewolves began to appear in miniatures games across the country. I didn't actually highlight this section, but another groundbreaking feature of Chainmail's section on man-to-man combat, the scale activity was a departure from the published or even house miniatures game rules. And Gary goes on talking a little bit more about Chainmail and just how popular it was at the time and such, and I'm not going to go into great detail there. Jumping on down, in a short section pertaining to siege warfare, I instructed the reader to use paper and pencil when dealing with the underground aspects of such battles. The mining, counter-mining, and secret escape routes employed during sieges were to be drawn out on graph paper. And so you have the very first instances of players, or, in this case, the generals, plotting out on graph paper dungeons. Essentially, this is the precursor to dungeons. All right, and Dave Arneson from St. Paul, Minnesota, didn't miss on that. He, really picked up on that, and they started to correspond and exchange ideas. The Dungeons & Dragons fantasy role-playing game was born out of Chainmail. So, absolutely, if you're looking to get the history of Dungeons & Dragons, if you're a really big fan of Dungeons & Dragons, then Chainmail is a game that you certainly want to get your hands on, a game booklet, so that you can kind of see how it evolves from there and moves forward into later editions of Dungeons & Dragons. And he goes more into the history of the different evolutions of the various versions of Dungeons & Dragons moving forward. Role-playing games are contests in which the player usually cooperate as a group to achieve a common goal rather than compete to eliminate one another from play. So that's the big difference between role-playing games and miniature games. All right, miniature games all pit individuals or teams against each other. Role games, in contrast, bring players together in a mutual effort to make their character succeed or at least survive against the hostile world environment. Mastery of such games requires not only individual excellence, but the ability to operate successfully within the group as well. And so now you're getting a much more cooperative, group-based feel and form of gameplay than you would in wargaming, where you might just be one person controlling an entire army. You might have several cooperative generals on one side and several cooperative generals on another, where you're interacting as a group, but it's not as defined as role-playing games are. And then within role-playing games, you have the different variations between, you're not just three generals and maybe one's offense, one's defense, and one's support, but you have much more variety of abilities in role-playing games. It is unquestionable that the pursuit of the games tends to be, this is really, really important. I want to focus on this because this is a common myth and a very common slight against old school gaming. And once again, Gary lays it out here very clearly what the intent was. All right, it is unquestionable that the pursuit of such games tends to be a social activity dominated by young men between 14 and 22 years of age. All ages and both sexes have much to contribute. Certainly and occasionally play outside the usual social peer group will bear great returns in increased understanding and ability. Once again, as it is reiterated in every single book in Dungeons and Dragons printed by TSR, and I'm certainly, I would guarantee that they're also reiterated in later editions of Dungeons and Dragons by Wizards of the Coast. It is a game that is open to everyone, and everyone's contribution is valued. And here he says, once again, all ages and both sexes have much to contribute, certainly and occasionally play outside the usual social peer group. So he's even recommending that you play outside of your usual social peer group as well. Will bear great returns in increased understanding and ability. So he's also talking about tournament play, convention play, as well as playing in your own home or in your own local game store. The more you play with different groups of people, the more you're going to increase your understanding and ability to play the game well, to master role-playing. The difference with role-playing games is that they ask all the participants to exercise this creative ability. When another person creates a make-believe situation and simply displays it before an audience, in the form of a book or a TV show, for instance, the audience simply absorbs the creator's imaginative output, but seldom, if ever, has the opportunity to add its own imagination to the product. All participants actually have important and demanding creative roles in such games, and their imaginative input is increased as long-term participation evolves. What he means right there, and he goes into the next line and clearly states it, this means that an ongoing role-playing game, referred to as a campaign, alters from its original form into an amalgam of the printed game and the creative imagination of the group involved. Participants, during the play of adventures or scenarios that take place in the context of a campaign, they derive more from the game at the same time. You shouldn't be playing this game as simply just one-shots. Always a one-shot, because you're limiting how much your players are going to grow within the context of the game. You're limiting your growth as a game master, and Gary made this very, very clear in his game mastery book as well, that campaigns is where it's at, and long-term campaigns. That is the only way that you are really going to grow and gain mastery of whether you're being a role player, gamer, or you're playing the role of a game master or dungeon master. He talks quite a bit about H.G. Wells and some of his writings, where he's talking a little bit about little fights and little wars versus, real things. And he's really kind of separating, and you can, the difference between what you do in a game and what happens afterwards. I think H.G. Wells said that there's, in the miniature games, miniatures don't leave any orphans behind. Miniatures don't, they don't have battle fatigue after, the game session is over. They don't bring their war home with them. And I think that this is a direct response. This book was written, or at least published, in 1987. So this is after the Great Satanic Panic. And, this is where Gary is talking about deflecting some of the arguments that people will take the violence that they participate in a game and take it to the outside. And so that's where he goes, and he speaks specifically. Reports mentioned to me indicate that a group of RPG hobbyists, the incidence of such behavior is 50 to 200 times smaller than in a typical populace at large. In other words, he's saying through various studies that had taken place, role players, gamers, hobbyists are less likely to be inclined to violence than the typical populace at large. A master player or game master does not allow, in fact never, gives a conscious thought to allowing actions taken in the context of the game to dictate or affect his or her activities in the real-world environment. A master knows the difference between role-playing, role assumption, and real life, and never mixes one of these with another. This is the best and indeed the only way to get the utmost benefit out of each activity. So, once again, for those that argue, and there's one YouTube commentator out there who really believes that you're supposed to take what you learn from the game and bring it out into the real world, and then what's going on in the real world and bring it into your game. And although it's impossible to keep them absolutely separate, you're going to have themes that are kind of common in both. You might have some experiences, like if you get into a real world fight, you might say, hey, you know what, my character was in a fight, last session as well, but they're just separate. They're only loosely associated, and that's really because you're associating them with one another. One is not influencing the other, or it's not supposed to be. So again, a master knows the difference between role-playing, role assumption, and real life, and never mixes one of these with another. This is the best and indeed the only way to get the utmost benefit out of each activity. You are going to harm your game if you're taking the real world and inserting it into your game world, inserting it into your activities of the game. You are going to potentially harm your real life by bringing what you are doing in a game and having it affect you in your real life. So if your character dies and then you are, depressed for days on end after your character died in the real world, and it's affecting, your ability to sleep right or something, you're doing yourself a disservice. You're not playing the game the way that the game was meant to be played, and you're just investing too much into an imaginary activity. All right, and so here you have Gary Gygax kind of warning us not to let the real world and the fantasy world mix. And then we're going to get to chapter 2 in the next video. All right, so the master player, and we'll get into what his discussion is on the master player. So So there you have it, a breakdown of chapter one. Some of the areas that I felt, to really focus on. If you have this book and you're reading through chapter one as well, and there are certain things that I skipped over that you think that I really should have focused on, please leave a comment in the comments section. If you really like this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you hadn't subscribed, please consider subscribing. And once again, if you have the book or you have access to the same PDF that I have or others, and you want to discuss the book, I would love to tear it down. Just we'll keep it to each video will be on a section or a chapter of the book, and we'll focus our conversation just within that chapter without going ahead into other chapters or back to previous chapters. And I'd really like doing like a book study, of this if you do have it. So once again, if you don't have it, try to get your hands on this. It is a real gem. It's something that I think even after all of these years of playing and running games, to actually read Gary's views on what it is to be a great role player or a master role player, and just some of his language, I was really impressed by how analytical and academic his writing is here. So that's something that really stood out to me as well, is that he really looks at the art of role playing or the art of game mastery in a very academic way, and it relates very well in in this form of his writing. It's really eye-opening. It's very, very interesting to see the comparison between Gary's writing in something like this and Gary's writing in some of his fiction novels as well. I think he's stronger here than there, but that's just me. That's just my opinion. But as a gaming theorist, I mean, he's certainly a genius when it comes to talking about role-playing games. So once again, I hope you like this video. Please enjoy Friday coming up. I just forgot that today is Thursday. And, so look forward to a video tomorrow. I might do a recap of our last two sessions in my AD&D First Edition campaign. Or certainly by Saturday, I'll have another video up. Might even get to chapter 2 of this over the weekend. So I like to let these sit there and occupy the channel for a couple of days by themselves, and then I'll introduce another video to kind of stretch them out and bring them along. So once again, thanks for joining. Have a great weekend coming up, and I look forward to seeing you on a gaming screen sometime soon. You'll have a great evening.